for being here. So the Bangladesh case study is joint work with Mohit Robo, John Hadanat, and Akhtar Ahmed, and it's funded by IFPRI, the World Bank, and the CGIAR. In terms of motivation for this case study, many of you probably know this figure that 1 in 3 women globally experience physical or sexual IPV in their lifetimes. Among that prevalence, South Asia is among the highest in the world at 41%. Lori overviewed this mixed methods review that showed cash transfer programs reduce IPV in low and middle income countries. Just to highlight that within the quantitative findings there, much of that evidence comes from Latin America. Much of it involves programs that have conditionalities or trainings. And within that evidence, all of these studies look at IPV impacts during the program, with very little, as far as I'm aware, none of them have quantitative evidence after the program is ended. So the focus of this case study is really to address one kind of big picture question, which is, can cash transfer programs be, 1, a globally relevant, 2, a scalable platform, and 3, for sustainably reducing IPV? And underlying that big question are 3 particular knowledge gaps. So first, as I mentioned, we really don't know what happens to IPV after the programs end. Most of the cash transfer programs of the type that Lori described with these regular payments don't continue indefinitely. Households will often get them for, say, 2 years. And if everything just kind of goes back to the way it was as soon as the program ends, then this is not a sustainable solution for reducing IPV. And so we really need to know what happens after, and to date there had not been any quantitative evidence there. A second touches on the issue of scale. So as Lori described, many of the programs in the evidence have some sort of complementary programming or some sort of conditionality. Many of these can be quite challenging to implement. And as she described, many of them are kind of bundled together with the cash, and as Tia also described, it's hard to figure out which parts of the impacts come from the cash versus these other program features. And from the perspective of thinking about scale, we really want to know, are they needed for IPV impacts? Do they affect the mechanisms? And then finally, we want a better sense of how much these findings generalize globally. So much of the evidence coming from Latin America may raise a question of whether this can then generalize to a setting like South Asia, where, for example, patriarchal norms and female seclusion still prevail. So, for example, female seclusion referring to the idea that women, there are norms around women staying within the home or traveling outside the home only with male accompaniment. You might imagine the dynamics around transfers to women might be quite different if they aren't able to go to markets by themselves. So this case study really contributes to 3 specific points. First, we investigate what happens after the transfers end. 2, we disentangle the effects of transfers from the effects of other accompanying features. And 3, we study a context in South Asia, Bangladesh, where IPV is high and norms are conservative. So the specific study setting is a program called the Transfer Modality Research Initiative, TMRI. And this was a pilot safety net program in Bangladesh that was designed as a cluster randomized control trial, implemented by the World Food Program and evaluated by the International Food Policy Research Institute, or IFPRI. This program provided cash or food transfers. In this presentation, we won't focus on the distinction there. What we will focus on is that some of the transfers were provided with an intensive nutrition behavior change communication, and I'll tell you more about what that means. And some were provided without, and that was randomized. And the program was implemented from 2012 to 2014, so for 2 years. It was targeted to mothers of young children in poor rural households, and this program had no explicit gender objective. So although I'll tell you a little bit about how the design could be considered gender sensitive, the aim was really to improve household food security and child nutrition. And in fact, IFPRI's evaluation was initially focused on those outcomes and not focused on gender. The BCC was, the Nutrition Behavior Change Communication, had 3 components. The core of it was these weekly group meetings that you see a picture of here, of 9 to 15 women in a village with a trained community nutrition worker. When I mentioned about the gender-sensitive design, some of these sessions also invited other household members to join, including husbands and mothers-in-law. And so these sessions were focused on infant and young child feeding. So part of the motivation for inviting other household members was to kind of, bring the messaging to other household members who are influential to increase take-up. But it also had the dimension of trying to increase acceptability of women coming to these sessions. So once the mothers-in-law and husbands came and saw what these were all about, they were much more okay with women kind of leaving the home to go to these every week. These sessions, despite kind of being about a pretty technical topic, were really interactive and fun. And women actually quite enjoyed them. For them who tended to be quite isolated, this was actually a really kind of transformative social opportunity. They had kind of a group of friends, they came early, they stayed late, and they genuinely enjoyed these sessions. The second component was twice a month home visits by these same community nutrition workers. And the third component was monthly meetings between the program staff and community leaders. Again, this partly was to kind of get the messages out to the community at large, but it also was to kind of sensitize the community to the importance of women coming to these meetings, so to kind of overcome some of the gender norms around women's mobility. So, as I mentioned, the main study had not been about gender, but what we did to look at post-program impacts on IPV was that we did what we referred to as a post-endline survey, 6 to 10 months after the program had ended. So in the green there you see the 2-year program period. 6 to 10 months later we went back and administered the WHO Violence Against Women instrument to the former beneficiary mothers. In order to conduct the analysis that we did for the IPV study, we also drew on the longitudinal data that we did have from the evaluation period. And we also drew some insights from a qualitative process evaluation that had been done during the intervention that was not specifically on gender or IPV, but which shed some light on some of the mechanisms that we believe underlie our impacts. So the study design for the IPV study compared 3 modalities. So we had a control group, which was the arms that had received no intervention, the transfers group, which lumped together the groups that had gotten cash only or food only, and then the transfers plus BCC group. So that lumped together the groups that had gotten cash plus BCC or food plus BCC. And I can tell you quickly that there were no differences within these lumped together groups. We saw no differences, but I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. So for a sample of 2,231 women, we exploited the fact that these were randomly assigned groups to estimate first the post-program impact of transfers alone on IPV, second, transfers plus BCC on IPV, and third, to try to look at the mechanisms for the impacts we find. So here's our core result. This figure shows at post-end line the prevalence of physical violence that was reported in the past 6 months among the control group, the transfer-only group, and the transfer plus BCC group. And what you see is in both the control group and the transfer-only group, the prevalence of physical violence is 27%. In the transfer plus BCC group, it's 20%, a 7 percentage point reduction, and that's a significant difference. And that represents a 26% reduction in physical violence from transfers plus BCC, and this again is 6 to 10 months after the program ended. So what this means is that transfers plus BCC significantly reduced physical violence well after the program ended. Meanwhile, transfers only had no significant impact 6 to 10 months later. So how do we think it is that the transfers plus BCC led to these sustained reductions? I'll try to go through this extremely quickly for how much is on the slide. But referring back to the mechanisms that Lori described, what we believe is that based on suggestive quantitative and qualitative evidence that there were 3 mechanisms at play. First, we believe that the transfers plus BCC relative to transfers only had sustained effects on improving women's bargaining power. That's in terms of her economic resources, her agency, and her social capital. So as I mentioned, these BCC sessions themselves increased women's social capital. Moreover, the fact that women now became viewed as a knowledgeable member of the community meant that neighbors were now coming over to hear from her what she had, she knew more about nutrition than they did. They came over to ask what they should do with their children. And these were such poor women that they previously been seen as, beggars and pariahs. Suddenly they were kind of seen as respected members of the community. A related dynamic is that as women became more visible and respected in the community, violence inflicted by their partner against them became more visible, so it was more detected, and there was more what's referred to in the literature as social control against it. So there was more disapproval on the part of the community and more kind of repercussions for her partner. So it's what we refer to as an increased cost of violence for the man. And then finally, I won't go into the details of this, but we actually see that the BCC increased household wealth as well beyond the transfers only arm. And so we believe that this could have resulted in the poverty-related stress and conflict pathways that Lori described coming into play as well. And we have a quote where a woman was described as saying that if she asked her husband to buy some food when there was none in the house, he would become angry and hit her. But now she says he's generally quite pleasant and doesn't fight with her anymore, which very much echoes the qualitative findings that Lori described. So to wrap up quickly, it's worth noting that in this context, where some might fear cash transfers targeted to women could lead to a backlash, we did not find any increases in IPV. But 6 to 10 months post-program, we found a 26% reduction in physical IPV among women that formerly received transfers plus BCC, while there was no impact at all on those that had received transfers only. Our suggestive evidence, which I didn't get into here, is that in fact both the modalities, transfers only and transfers plus BCC, had reduced IPV during the program, but that the plus BCC was required to sustain the impacts beyond the end of the program. And essentially, in the transfer-only arm, things went back to the way they were as soon as the transfers ended. As I said, we believe this comes through women's bargaining power, men's cost of violence, and poverty-related stress and conflict. This is, to our knowledge, the first quantitative evidence of transfer programs having impacts on IPV beyond the end of the program. And we think the real takeaway here is that transfer programs can cause sustained reductions in IPV, and this is even without any gender-focused objectives. But they may require some sort of complementary activities that sustainably affect the pathways for impact. And so when the transfers disappear, there needs to be something that continues. In this case, we think it was that the BCC led to women's status sustainably improving beyond the end of the program. And just to mention, as Lori said, you'll have these slides, I think. So the link for the academic paper is on the left. The picture on the right is a little brief that we have of this study, and just to plug a few other little briefs we have right outside the door. On the counter over there, you'll find a little postcard that summarizes Lori's review paper, as well as this study and a couple other studies we have on cash transfers and IPV. So please don't forget to look for them on your way out. Thank you.